most people think of backup communications options, they think of something that looks like this. There's more out there that we can consider as options. Today, we're going to talk about some of the options that exist and how Meshtastic compares to these options. Although Meshtastic isn't perfect, it does have some unique benefits that none of the others can claim. Make sure you stick around until the end because you'll definitely want to hear about the pros that Meshtastic has to offer. Let's first talk about handheld radios. A lot of them look something like this. That could be ham radio, GMRS, or even just a basic walkie-talkie using FRS. Quick recap for anybody that doesn't know a lot about these things. So ham radio requires a license that you get through the FCC. There is a test required. GMRS requires a license as well, but it's just pay to play. Your entire family can communicate using GMRS systems on one of the radios I just showed you. FRS doesn't require a license at all, but they are a lot lower power. Let's do a quick recap for anybody who's not familiar with ham radio, GMRS, or FRS. Ham radio and GMRS each require a license. For ham radio, you need to take a test. For GMRS, it's essentially pay to play. It gets you access for 10 years for your entire family. FRS uses much lower power radios, but they don't require a license at all. Think of this like your typical walkie-talkie. What they all have in common is their mode of operation. What I mean by that is how you actually use the device to communicate, and that's voice. Now, ham radio operators, before you run to the comments and talk about digital modes, I'm keeping this simplistic. Now, most of the time, voice is completely sufficient for communicating with a radio. This is the standard way people use radios, at least that's what most people think, but there's a problem. I like to call it the synchronous limitation. What does that mean? In order to actually communicate using voice over a radio like the one I showed you, you both have to be using the radios at the same time. If you didn't catch the message because you were distracted or you weren't at the radio or the radio was just off, you're not going to get the message. So that can be a problem. If you really needed to hear that information and it only ever happened once and it won't happen again unless the other person repeats it, it's lost. Let's move on to the privacy aspect of ham radio and GMRS. A lot of people who are getting into comms are concerned with encryption, and using ham radio or GMRS, it's just a non-starter. You cannot obscure the meaning of your messages at all. For the most part, people getting into ham radio and GMRS just accept this as a limitation. It's important to remember with ham radio or GMRS, anybody could be listening at any time, so it's paramount that you don't share private details that you don't want somebody else to hear. When you're using ham radio or GMRS, you have to give your call sign when you're transmitting. People can look that call sign up and figure out where you live. That is another limitation that people accept whenever they use ham radio or GMRS. I've given a lot of cons, but let me be really clear. These radio systems are fantastic, and there's a reason so many people use them. They're the go-to for voice transmissions. But voice transmissions do have their limitations. Another thing to note is that voice transmissions can only go so far, mostly because of the radios that you're using. These handheld radios don't have a ton of power, and one transmission can usually make it anywhere from 1 mile to 5 miles, depending on your location. There are repeater systems that can extend that out, but generally speaking, handheld voice radios are not going to get your transmissions super far. Now let's move on to something a little bit different. This one has unlimited range. You could use it literally in the middle of nowhere. You don't need cell service. You don't need Wi-Fi. Oh, and you don't need voice either. I'm talking about satellite messengers. Satellite messengers are really popular for hikers, backpackers, people who go off-roading in the middle of nowhere. They give you connectivity and peace of mind where there is no other option. You can even go a step further and get a true satellite phone, which does allow for synchronous communications. But with these satellite messengers, you can just message people the same way you would with your cell phone. Honestly, for a lot of people, I recommend this as the first backup option to day-to-day communications using a cell phone. Despite what the internet might have you believe, not every calamity affects the entire world. Oftentimes, emergencies that can take out your cell service or Wi-Fi are hyper-localized. And honestly, these are the things you're way more likely to face than some worldwide catastrophe. All of that to say, the things that can take out the infrastructure that allows these devices to work the way they do would be worldwide emergencies, which are very unlikely to occur. Most of the time, these devices are going to be perfect for backup communications. But there is a catch. Even though you own the device, you don't necessarily own the transmissions. You're essentially renting a signal from the companies that sell these devices. None of them work without a subscription model. In order for your device to keep working, you got to pay on time. And if you don't, your ability to use the device gets cut off. It would really suck to be in an emergency where you need one of these things, but you find out it stopped working because you changed credit cards a year ago, or your credit card expired, or there was just a billing error. All that to say, some innocuous life occurrence could cut off your emergency communications line. This is the problem with renting the signal. Another thing to note is that you are relying on a company's infrastructure. You're relying on your signal to make it to a satellite, and that satellite has to be able to send its signal either to another satellite or the gateway on the ground that connects you with the internet. If anything along that path fails, your message might not make it. It could be something as innocuous as a bug in the software. Essentially, you don't own the pathway. You just own a piece of equipment that allows you access. And that's a stark difference from the devices I showed you earlier, like a handheld radio where you just talk into it. You own the transmissions because you own the device. Another thing to note about satellite messengers is that they can be a little bit pricey. They typically start around $150 and they go up from there. And you're also going to spend anywhere from $12 a month all the way up to $30 a month, depending on how many messages you want as a part of your subscription. As you might imagine, that can rack up over time. If you're paying $30 a month, that's $360 a year, plus the $300 you probably spent on the device, and that can add up. Oh, and that's just for one of them. So if you want multiple for your entire family, it just multiplies from there. Now again, I really like satellite messengers, and for the most part, they're one of the best options you can have for backup communications. But that doesn't mean there aren't flaws. Now that we've covered handheld transceivers that use voice and satellite messengers that use satellite constellations to get your messages anywhere in the world, we're going to move on to Meshtastic. If you want to recap on what Meshtastic is, go ahead and watch video number 1 where I cover it in detail. Let's start with the first benefit that I'd like to talk about: asynchronous communication. As a quick review, we talked about synchronous communication at the beginning of this video. That means you have to be talking at the same time that somebody is listening and vice versa. Asynchronous communication, on the other hand, would be where you can send a message and somebody can come read it at their leisure, so whenever they get to their device. The benefits here are pretty clear. If you're not at your device when an important message comes through, you can simply access it later, and then you can access it again whenever you want, because it's stored on the device. This works a lot better for group coordination when multiple people are doing different things. I personally benefited from this when hunting in the woods of Pennsylvania. Using voice radios when deer hunting can spook the deer, and that's not good for anybody. So using Meshtastic devices, we were able to message each other and get to the messages when we could. This made it a lot easier to coordinate while still keeping the hunt going. I'm sure that you could come up with a ton of reasons that this would be beneficial. That's just one. Let's move on to the next Meshtastic benefit: legal encryption. As I said at the beginning of the video, using GMRS or ham radio, you simply cannot encrypt your messages. Well, technically you can, but it's not legal to do. Meshtastic, on the other hand, follows the same rules as Bluetooth and Wi-Fi, which means you can legally encrypt it. Group messages use AES 256, and DMs use PKC, which stands for Public Key Cryptography. Now, this doesn't mean that your messages are completely unbreakable. We're not going to get into a cryptography lesson here, but it is pretty secure for your basic needs. If you set up a private group for your family, the messages in that family group chat will be reasonably secure. Basically, this benefit is protecting you from outside eavesdroppers. But don't worry, we'll have an entire discussion on Meshtastic and security and OPSEC much later in this series. Let's move on to the next benefit, which is a self-healing network. It's right in the name. Meshtastic uses mesh networking. Now, what does that mean? Basically, every device acts as a repeater for all the other devices. There are some rules in there, like how many times a message can be passed on, but for the most part, it's simple. If my device hears a message from your device, but I know the guy on the other side of me hasn't heard the message, I can pass it along to him. Let's say that my device gets taken down, but there are other devices near me. Then your message could still get to the guy back there through one of these other paths. And that's the premise of a self-healing network. Let's contrast this with our handheld radios that we talked about at the beginning of the video. For the most part, there is no true automated mesh networking with handheld transceivers. GMRS does get you access to one repeater hop. That means if I talk into my radio and I'm able to hit a repeater with my transmission, that repeater can send it out one more time, and it might have a really big radius. But after that, you're not going any further, unless somebody manually retransmits your message. Ham radio has more complex and powerful options, but that also means that you have to have a license. But most of the time, these systems are still relying on manual intervention or integration with some other system. Meshtastic, on the other hand, is self-contained and designed to be automated when it comes to forwarding messages. Now, I've given a lot of benefits to Meshtastic, but let's take a quick second to talk about the drawbacks. The first one is that you're only sending short text messages. That's it. You're not going to be able to send voice transmissions, and you're not going to be able to send photos. Another drawback is that it's subject to a lot of latency. Meshtastic is subject to quite a bit of latency. It's even slower than a typical text message because these messages have to move slowly through the mesh network. Another barrier to entry is the open source nature of this project. A lot of the hardware out there comes in little development boards, so not finished units. This can scare people away. Although these devices typically aren't that expensive, the setup can be a little daunting. I've spent a ton of time watching YouTube videos, reading through GitHub, Discord, Reddit, taking all these different sources of information and having to read through all of it just to understand how it works. For a lot of people, that is the draw. They want to tinker with an up-and-coming technology. For people that want it to work out of the box and do what people said it would do, it can be a massive headache to have to wade through all of the information that's out there. Here's one common failure point. People order the equipment, they start to set it up, but they just get lost in the configuration. They don't know which buttons to press. They don't know which settings to set. Now that a lot of ready-to-use devices have come onto the market, this tends to be the biggest barrier. The next biggest barrier that I see is that people don't understand exactly how the 915 megahertz band, which Meshtastic uses, works. Lastly, people often don't understand how the meshing algorithm for Meshtastic works. It's not exactly intuitive. A lot of these barriers to entry come with the territory of working with an open source project. The main purpose behind this video series is taking people all the way from not knowing anything about this or maybe having some struggles all the way to competent users. If you don't want to wait for the next video to drop, or if you preferred more structured training on this stuff, I have a solution. I've made a more academic version of this YouTube video series that has quizzes, structured lessons, handouts, and exercises. Now, it is a paid course. It costs $50. You don't have to take it though. If you watch this YouTube series, you can get everything that you need to know about Meshtastic. But if you're looking for something more structured, that is an option. Either way, thanks for watching. Drop me a comment, make sure to subscribe, and I appreciate you.